Hello and welcome to the tutorial on how to draw projects for the laser cutter. We're going to be covering a software called Inkscape. This is a vector graphic drawing software, and I strongly encourage you to go ahead and go to the website inkscape.org and download a version for your computer. It runs on Windows, Mac, Linux, any kind of computer that you got. It's free and open source. So go ahead and download it and install it on your PC and follow along with me. Feel free to pause the video and play around with the stuff that I'm showing you and take the video at your leisure. This is really about kind of experimenting and exploring and getting a sense for what you can do here. So first off, let's talk about what a vector graphic is. Now on the right, you can see a pretty typical pixelated approximation of a circle, right? We can see that the computer has just grabbed a bunch of pixels in the rough approximation of a circle and colored them black. Now that has a couple of downsides to it, right? The computer doesn't really accurately reproduce the circle. It's just done the best job it can in filling in the right dots to be black or white to make that circle. And number two, most critically for us, if we want to send this job to a machine like a laser cutter, is the computer doesn't actually know what's going on here. I drew a circle, it drew all those pixels to be black, and it has immediately forgotten what is going on here. It just knows, well, now these pixels are black. Now, instead of that pixelated approximation, what we can do is instead we can use a vector graphic, where the computer is intrinsically understanding that there is a circle, its color is black, it is centered here, it has a radius of that. And so this way, not only do we have a perfect representation of that circle, but we also have a deeper understanding of what this shape is. And so when I ask the computer to do things with this, it's going to be a lot more easily understood. So I can select this thing and I can make it red if I want, because it understands that is a circle and I've now changed the color to be red. So let's get started with a quick tour of the software page itself. Now, I've got a new window here, a new document with nothing in it. And the first place you're probably going to start is on the left bar here. This is where you're going to be drawing shapes. So I can say, click on the square and draw a square. I can click on the circle, draw a circle, that kind of thing. There are simple things like just lines and more complicated things like maybe stars or hexagons, that kind of thing. And so oftentimes your project is going to start off as some basic shapes like this that we're going to manipulate into more complex shapes. Now, up at the top here, this is a bunch of options for tweaking those shapes. So for instance, here you can see I draw the circle on top of the square, but if I wanted the square on top of the circle, I can use these buttons here to arrange the order of them. So I could put the square on top, and now we can see that the square overlaps the circle instead of the other way around. We can also change a shape's position and size by typing into these boxes here. So I can easily set this to be exactly 20 millimeters wide if I so choose. On the right, these are some general utility options, things like creating a new document, undoing and redoing, cut and copy, stuff like that. And then here on the bottom, this is where we can select colors for our shapes. So if I select an object by clicking on it, I can click on one of these colors to set the fill to be that color. And if I hold down Shift when I click on a color, it is going to set the outline to be that color. So I can set this to be green inside and blue outside. Now for our purposes, what we're going to be doing here, I suggest that you turn off the outline, what Inkscape calls the stroke. So I will hold down Shift and then click on the little white with the X on it, and that will disable that. And so now I have a shape that is just green fill with no outline at all. So now let's get into the meat of this tutorial, where we can take some of these simple shapes and convert them into more complex shapes that do what we want to do. And we're going to do that by working through a really basic project of making a sort of desktop name tag holder. So what we're going to do is we're going to make two shapes that fit together So we've got a base and a vertical part, and we'll put our name and some other stuff on there and go from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with some squares. So I'm just going to draw those two components as squares from the get-go. Now, something that you'll see, whenever I select one of these options, this top bar has changed to specific options for this task. So here, because I'm drawing a square, if I want, I can type the width and height of that square up here, and I can also set a corner radius if I so choose. But I'll just go back to the standard selection tool here, and I can put that wherever I like. And if I skipped the original selection as I did, I can always type in here. So let's go with something that's a little on the smaller side, maybe say 50 millimeters or 2 inches wide and 25 millimeters or 1 inch tall. And so we can resize it there. Now, for simplicity, we can also make the base about the same size. So I'll just Control-C and Control-V to make a copy of that. And so we've got our basic shape here. But now what we want to do is we want to add some tabs and some slots so that this top piece can fit into the bottom. And so I'll do that very simply by just drawing more squares. So I'll draw a shape that is the size of the tab that I want. Now, what we'll do here is for the height of this tab, I'm going to want to choose the thickness of the material that I'm working with. So if I cared about this being really nice, I would take some calipers and measure the material I was going to use. But in this case, it's probably going to be about 3 millimeters, so I'll just type that in here. So it's 3 millimeters high, and now I can just choose whatever width of tab I want. I'm going to go with a nice even 10 millimeters thick. And so here's my little tab. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of the snapping features in Inkscape, which are really cool. That is enabled or disabled by clicking this button up here on the top. And you can even get super complicated about what things you want it to snap to what. So do I want to snap to the center of an object? I can enable that or disable that here. Really, really cool. And so what I can do, I can use the snapping feature to drag this thing right to the corner of where I want it to be. And I can copy and paste and put another one right at this corner. And so I'll just get it to snap to the bounding box corners, just like so. If I want, I can also zoom in and out by holding Control and then using the scroll wheel to zoom in. And that can sometimes help get it to snap where I want. So I've got these corners fit exactly where they should be. And so now you can see here, I've got 2 tabs added into my piece. And I can do the same thing again to make 2 slots, cutouts in the bottom piece that these tabs will fit into. So all I'm going to do is drag a box around these 2 objects. Inkscape will only select things that are entirely within that box. So you'll see here, because I'm not selecting the main shape in its entirety, it gets ignored. But if I did this, then I get all 3. But I will take these 2, and I can simply copy and paste again, and snap these to be right in the center of this other piece. And so now I have my top piece, and I have my bottom piece more or less laid out. Now, if I told the laser cutter to cut this bottom piece like this, right, what it will do is it will cut 3 rectangles. And I will end up with this H-shaped piece, and that will do what I want it to do. And I'll waste my time a little bit because it will cut this little area here twice, but that's not a big deal. Now, of course, for this one, it is a big deal because it's going to cut through my tab, and that's no good. So what I need to do is I need to join these shapes together into one continuous shape. And the way I'm going to do that is with what is basically the geometric equivalent of arithmetic. So if I select those 3 shapes and go to Path up here, I can do a union, and that will create a new shape, which is the area covered by all the shapes I selected. And so that looks like this. Now, it is good practice as well to do a subtraction to cut out shapes. So if I select, say, the original green rectangle and one of these red rectangles, I can do a difference. and that will subtract the thing in the front from the thing behind. Now, a minor annoyance with subtraction is the order of operations, right? When it comes to arithmetic, when you have a plus b plus c plus d, it doesn't really matter if you do it in that order or a plus d plus c plus b, you get the same answer. But when you're doing subtraction, order matters. And if I select three things, it doesn't know, am I subtracting this and then from that, or what? So what I'll have to do is I will actually add together all the things I want to subtract. And now I have two things, one in the front, one in the back. And now the computer will understand what I want when I say difference. And now I have two shapes, which will fit together to make my overall shape that I want. Now what we have here is the basic geometry set, but it's still a little boring, right? It's just a box. So let's try to gussy it up a little bit, make it a little bit more interesting. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to another really cool tool, which is this option down here. This is how we can directly manipulate the lines and segments and points that make up the shapes that we've got. And so what we can see is when I've selected this, we can see the individual points that define this shape. And I can grab those individual points and I can move them around. I can also grab the lines and go ahead and yank those around. And so what you can see here is what we've done is we've turned that simple straight line into a curve. This is really the secret under the hood of what a vector graphic is. And so this curved shape is essentially defined by 4 points. There's where it starts and where it ends. And then these 2 points, which are called handles, they define how the curve goes in or out from those points. And so we can see here, I almost think about it as sort of like the velocity. It shoots off in this direction fast or slow before finally curving back around to meet up with the other point. And so this is a really kind of simple but powerful way to describe very nice organic kind of sweeping lines with just 4 points. Much simpler than a huge number of pixels that you might otherwise have to use to describe this kind of shape. So this is just an opportunity to kind of play around. I don't want to mess around with any of these because that will change how the tabs fit or don't fit into the slots we created just a minute ago. But everything else is up for grabs. So sometimes what I like to do is delete additional points, and this makes it easier to have a nice sweeping shape from one place to another. But I can always say double click and create a new point if I want to manipulate that as well. And of course, just like everywhere else, now that I'm in this mode, I've got this whole new set of options that I can do to create points, to delete them, to join them, and also to change how the line interacts with that. So this is a tangent node so that the line always goes through it really nice and smooth, but we can also make it a cusp. And so now it will come to a point here, potentially, depending on what I want to do. So we can just play around and make this whatever shape we want, and make it a little bit more interesting. So you can see here how we've relatively quickly gone from what used to be just a few rectangles into something that's a lot more interesting. Not only does it have these interesting complex shapes, but it also has these very critical sort of dimensions and interlocking features that can allow us to join multiple pieces into a larger project. So these are really powerful tools. I really encourage you to experiment and play around with them. But what we've got so far, right, is we've now got the outline of 2 shapes that we want to cut out. But the laser cutter can also engrave things. So let's go ahead and throw some stuff on top of this. And so we can engrave something like maybe, I'll put my name on here. And we can also go ahead and put in some other visuals. And so here what I'll show you, the last tool, is how we can take a pixelated image and turn it into a vector graphic that the laser cutter will be happy to work with. So we're just going to start off going to Google, and I'm going to look for a picture of a dog to throw onto my little name tag. And so here we are just in Google image search. Now, of course, my life is going to be a lot easier if I try to steer clear of some of these fancy colors. Unfortunately, the laser cannot cut in color. So what we're going to want is to maybe start playing around with some of the tools here and say, hey, instead of having it be color, let's look for black and white images. And so this is going to be a little bit better, but even better than some of these, what we probably want is something that's kind of more like a clip art rather than a classy black and white photo. And so something like this is going to work really, really well to put on our project. So I'm just going to simply copy this image and go back to Inkscape, where I can paste it into my project. So we can see here, this is a pixelated image. And what I'll have to do is use the computer in its trace bitmap feature to try to trace this out and turn it into a vector graphic. Now, there are a whole bunch of options here that you can play around with. There are different techniques that it can apply to try to trace an image. There are different ways that it can try to smooth and optimize that. So you can feel free to play around with those. But in this case, the defaults are just fine for me. So all I have to do is say apply, and presto. Now what I've got is, we can see here, there is the original pixelated version and my traced version right next to it. And that looks fantastic. So all I got to do is I'll just delete my original pixelated image. And now I can stick my dog right on here. So I'm just going to move it around. You can see here I've got these little rescaling bars, so I can just grab onto one of these corners and start to scale it. Now you'll see by default it just kind of wants to go wherever I'm dragging, and that's not great. So I want my dog to not look weird, so I'm going to hold down the Control key, and that's going to keep it scaled 1-to-1 as I make it smaller. On all of these tools, everything that you're doing, Control, Shift, and Alt will do really interesting changes to what you're asking it to do. So in the case of scaling, right, I showed you Control. If I hold down Shift, it stays in the middle as I scale it, for instance. So definitely, I always keep my hand on those keys, and they will be very handy for you as you're trying to make stuff. But here is my final little drawing. So the only thing that I've got left to do here is I want to set the color codes in order to help communicate to the laser cutter what I want to do. And so what I'll do is I'm going to keep my engravings as being solid black, just like it is. And for the cuts, I'm just going to select the things that I want to cut out. And now, as the very last step, I'm going to disable the fill by clicking down here and shift-clicking on a different color, in this case, red. It doesn't really matter which color you choose, just so long as you group like things as the same color. I could use purple or pink, just so long as they're all the same. And so this is a pretty typical project. I've got an engraving in black, and I have a cut in red. But there may be reasons why you may want to engrave more in one place and less in another. Maybe you don't want to cut all the way through over here. So you can use as many colors as you like to separate those out. Now, the last thing that we're going to have to do here is just prepare the document to save and send over. Now, what we'll see is, by default, we started off with a document size. It's basically a standard sheet of paper, right? A 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper. Now, for what we're doing here, that's enough. We can go ahead and arrange our pieces into this document, get them all nice and snugged up so we're not wasting too much material. But we may also have to change this, right? Our laser cutter can cut up to 2 by 3 foot or 3 by 4 foot, depending on which machine you're using. And so obviously I could have drawn something that was much bigger than the sheet of paper. And so just in case I need to tweak that, I can go over here to Document Properties. And here I can change that document size wherever I like. So I can set a custom size. So maybe I want to make my document the size of the laser cutter, so 36 by 24, and I can do that right here. And now we can see how that's going to work. Or alternatively, something that I'll often do is if I have a piece of material that I'm starting with, maybe I went to the store and bought a sheet that is 12 inches by 12 inches. This is a great place to set that, maybe at the very beginning of your drawing. And so now we know what we can get away with. You know, do I want to make multiple copies of this? How many can I fit in this sheet before I run out of space? So now that we've got our document size set appropriately, we've got all of our job inbounds inside the document, we are ready to save this file and take it over to the laser cutter.